The morning of April 23, 1945 broke cold and gray over Camp Swift, Texas, where German prisoners of war stood behind chain-link fences, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Among them were 12 women, Helferinnen, female auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, who had been captured during the final collapse of Nazi forces in Europe. These women, trained as radio operators, nurses, and administrative personnel, believed they understood the Americans from propaganda broadcasts and whispered rumors in their barracks. But nothing had prepared them for what they witnessed that Thursday morning when a convoy of olive-drab trucks rolled through the camp's main gate, disgorging not the expected male soldiers, but 30 American women in uniform, each carrying an M1 Garand rifle, with the casual confidence of seasoned troops. Greta Hoffmann, a former communications officer from Munich who now wore the coarse gray uniform of a prisoner, pressed her face against the fence wire, her knuckles white with disbelief. The women marching across the dusty compound wore the distinctive uniform of the Women's Army Corps, and they moved with military precision toward the firing range at the camp's eastern perimeter. "Das ist unmöglich," she whispered to her companion, Margareta Schiller, a nurse who had served in a field hospital near Aachen. The concept seemed to violate everything they had been taught about the proper roles of men and women in wartime. According to records from the National Archives and contemporary reports from Stars and Stripes military newspaper, the Women's Army Corps had been conducting weapons training at various military installations throughout 1944 and 1945, preparing female personnel for a wider range of duties as the war stretched American military resources thin. The German prisoners, however, had no context for this reality. In Nazi Germany, women's roles had been strictly confined to the 3 Ks, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. While the desperation of total war had eventually forced Germany to employ women in auxiliary roles, the idea of women as combat-trained shooters remained antithetical to Nazi ideology. As the American women reached the firing range, a stocky sergeant with red hair visible beneath her service cap began directing them into formation. The German prisoners watched in stunned silence as each woman checked her weapon with practiced movements, loading 8-round clips into their rifles with smooth efficiency. The sergeant's voice carried across the distance, sharp and authoritative, giving commands that sent the women into prone, kneeling, and standing positions. When the order to fire came, the crack of 30 rifles shattered the morning air in a thunderous volley. Greta flinched involuntarily, not from fear but from the cognitive dissonance of witnessing something her entire cultural framework insisted was impossible. These were not masculine women or exceptions to some rule. They represented an entirely different understanding of what women could be. The shots continued in controlled bursts, and even from a distance, Greta could see the tight groupings forming on the distant targets. These American women were not merely playing at being soldiers. They were genuinely skilled marksmen, or rather markswomen. The demonstration continued for nearly 2 hours on that April morning, and the German women prisoners found themselves unable to look away despite the guard tower personnel occasionally shouting at them to disperse. Margareta Schiller, who at 31 was among the oldest of the female POWs, remembered her training at a Wehrmacht auxiliary school in Bavaria, where instructors had emphasized that women supported the war effort through morale, medical care, and maintaining communications, never through violence itself. The ideological foundation she had absorbed taught that women's essential nature made them unsuited for combat, that their role was to preserve life, not take it. Yet here stood evidence contradicting that entire worldview. The American women on the range weren't struggling or failing, they were excelling. Between firing exercises, Greta observed them laughing, adjusting their positions, and receiving correction from their instructors with the same professional demeanor she had seen in male soldiers. One woman, tall and blonde, reminded her painfully of her younger sister back in Munich, if Munich still stood. The woman handled her rifle with such natural competence that it forced Greta to question whether the limitations she had accepted for herself were truly natural or simply cultural constructions. By mid-morning, the training had progressed to more complex exercises. The American women practiced rapid target acquisition, moving between positions while maintaining fire discipline. A lieutenant, her rank visible even at a distance, demonstrated a technique for transitioning from marching formation to defensive position, and the entire group executed the maneuver with impressive coordination. Several of the German prisoners exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. Their silence contained both skepticism and a dawning recognition that perhaps American society operated under fundamentally different assumptions about human capability. As documented in historical records from the Women's Army Corps headquarters, by 1945 over 140,000 American women had enlisted in the WEC, serving in every theater of war except direct ground combat positions. These women worked as mechanics, drivers, telephone operators, postal workers, and yes, they received weapons training for security duties and self-defense. The gulf between American and German approaches to women's participation in the war effort reflected deeper ideological differences, ones that went beyond military strategy to touch on fundamental questions about human nature and social organization. During the brief water break around 10:30 that morning, one of the American sergeants approached the fence line where the German women stood clustered. She was a compact woman with dark eyes and a slight Tennessee drawl, and she addressed them through the fence with a translator present. "Y'all look surprised," she said, a half-smile playing at her lips. "Didn't think women could shoot?" The translator, a German-American corporal named Elizabeth Weber, conveyed the question, and several prisoners nodded mutely. The sergeant's smile widened. "Well, we're full of surprises. We can vote too when we get home. You might want to think about that." The comment landed like a grenade among the prisoners. Voting, political participation, had been another dimension of life largely denied to German women under Nazi rule, though they had possessed limited suffrage rights during the Weimar period. The casual way this American sergeant connected military competence with political rights suggested a worldview where these capabilities were simply accepted, rather than endlessly debated. For Greta, the moment crystallized something she had been unable to articulate. The Americans weren't trying to make women into men. They had simply expanded their definition of what women already were. As the sun climbed higher on that late April day in 1945, casting sharp shadows across Camp Swift, the German women prisoners retreated to their barracks for the mandatory midday count and meal. The wooden structure that housed them, Building 17 according to the faded number painted above the door, contained 24 bunks arranged in military precision. The 12 women occupied half the space, sharing their quarters with 12 Hungarian women who had been captured while serving with German forces during the collapse of Budapest in February. Today, however, conversation proved difficult despite their growing linguistic common ground. Each woman seemed lost in private thoughts about the morning's revelation. Greta Hoffman sat on her lower bunk, absently eating the tasteless but adequate meal of white beans, cornbread, and canned peaches that POWs received. Her mind kept returning to a conversation she had overheard in her Wehrmacht office back in early 1944, when victory still seemed possible to some. A colonel had been discussing reports of Soviet women serving as snipers, pilots, and tank commanders, dismissing them as propaganda or claiming they represented the desperate barbarism of Bolshevism. Civilized nations, he had proclaimed, do not send their mothers and sisters to fight like savages. Yet the American women she had witnessed that morning bore no resemblance to propaganda caricatures of either Soviet desperation or masculine aberration. They had been professional, competent, and entirely ordinary in their extraordinarity. Margareta Schiller broke the silence that had settled over the barracks. "Did you see how the sergeant corrected that young one's stance?" she asked quietly, addressing no one in particular. "The way she touched her shoulder, adjusted her position. It was exactly how my medical instructor taught us to position patients for examination. The same pedagogy, the same transmission of knowledge." Her observation opened a floodgate, and suddenly the women were talking rapidly, comparing what they had witnessed to their own training experiences, trying to reconcile the morning's evidence with everything they believed they knew. "My brother trained at the rifle range in Stuttgart," offered Ilse Brandt, a 22-year-old who had worked as a typist at Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin. "He wrote to me about it, made it sound like some sacred masculine ritual, this transformation into a warrior. But those women this morning, they made it look like learning to drive a truck or operate a telegraph. Technical, yes, requiring practice, but not mystical. Her words captured something essential about what had disturbed the German prisoners so deeply. The Americans had demystified military competence, treating it as an acquirable skill rather than an innate masculine essence. According to Susan Zeiger's research documented in Uncle Sam's Service, Women Workers with the American Expeditionary Force, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, American women's military participation had roots extending back to World War I, when thousands served overseas in support roles. This historical continuity meant that by World War II, the concept of uniformed women serving their nation had already achieved a degree of normalization in American culture, despite ongoing resistance and limitations. The German prisoners, lacking this historical context, interpreted what they saw through the lens of their own recent experience, a regime that had initially rejected women's public roles before desperately mobilizing them when the war turned catastrophic. As afternoon light slanted through the barracks windows, casting golden rectangles on the worn wooden floor, Greta found herself thinking about return and rebuilding. Germany was destroyed. Even without specific news, the prisoners could deduce this from their guards' casual conversations and the dates of their capture. Whatever awaited them back home would be drastically different from what they had left. Perhaps, she thought, the American women on the firing range that morning represented not just a different national culture, but a possible future. One where necessity would force reconsideration of old assumptions about what women could and should do. The thought was simultaneously frightening and oddly liberating, a small light in the darkness of defeat and displacement. Corporal Judith Martinez of the Women's Army Corps had been stationed at Camp Swift since February of 1945, one of 45 WAC personnel assigned to various administrative and security duties at the sprawling prisoner of war facility. At 24 years old, she had enlisted in the fall of 1943 after her older brother was killed at Salerno, driven by a fierce determination to contribute something more than rolling bandages or selling war bonds. That Thursday afternoon, after completing the morning's rifle qualification exercises, she found herself assigned to supervise a work detail of German female prisoners in the camp laundry facility, an assignment that would provide an unexpected opportunity for cross-cultural exchange. The laundry building, a long corrugated metal structure that trapped heat like an oven even in spring, housed industrial washing machines that processed thousands of pounds of uniforms and linens weekly. Judith watched as 6 German women, including the tall one she had noticed watching intently from the fence that morning, began sorting soiled items into appropriate categories. The work was menial but necessary, and Judith had learned during her months at Camp Swift that supervising prisoners required a balance of vigilance and humanity. These women weren't dangerous. Most seemed relieved to be out of the war, fed regularly, and safe from Allied bombing that had devastated their homeland. After about 30 minutes of silent work punctuated only by the rhythm of sorting and the distant hum of machinery, the tall German woman, Greta according to the identification card attached to her uniform, addressed Judith in hesitant but serviceable English. "Excuse, please. This morning, the shooting. You train always like this?" The question was simple, but Judith recognized the deeper inquiry behind it. She had seen that particular expression before, on the faces of male prisoners who struggled to reconcile their propagandized understanding of American society with the reality they encountered. "We train twice monthly for weapons qualification," Judith replied, choosing to engage rather than maintain cold professional distance. "It's required for anyone who might pull security duty or work in certain positions. Same standards as the men at their qualification level." She paused, then added, "You looked surprised this morning. At the fence." It was Greta's turn to pause, and Judith could see her weighing whether honesty might somehow be held against her. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, surprised. In Germany, in our experience, this is not expected. Women with weapons, shooting as soldiers." As noted in Lisa D. Meyer's scholarly work, Creating G.I. Jane Sexuality and Power in the Women's Army Corps During World War II, published by Columbia University Press, the very existence of armed military women generated significant cultural anxiety and debate within American society itself. Conservative critics argued that military service would masculinize women and disrupt traditional family structures, while supporters contended that defending the nation was a responsibility that transcended gender. Judith herself had faced skepticism from her own father, a World War I veteran who initially refused to speak to her after her enlistment, believing she had somehow shamed the family. It wasn't expected in America either, not at first, Judith said, surprising herself with her willingness to share this complexity. Lots of men, some women too, said, "We couldn't do it, shouldn't do it. But there's a war on, and it turns out we can do most things just as well when given the chance and proper training." She watched Greta process this information, seeing something shift in the other woman's expression. "The thing is," Judith continued, "it's not about being like men or replacing men. It's about being useful, being part of something bigger than yourself." Greta nodded slowly, then returned to sorting laundry. But Judith sensed the conversation had opened a door that would not easily close. For the remainder of the afternoon, as the work detail proceeded and the Texas sun beat down on the metal roof, Judith found herself thinking about the strange accident of birth and politics that had placed her on one side of a fence and these German women on the other. They weren't so different in age or apparent capability. Yet ideology and national circumstance had led them to vastly different understandings of what women might become. Watching Greta work with quiet efficiency, Judith wondered what the German woman might have achieved in different circumstances, with different opportunities. The question haunted her long after the work detail ended and the prisoners returned to their barracks, a reminder that war divided not just nations, but also possibilities. On the evening of April 26, 1945, 3 days after witnessing the American women's rifle training, Greta Hoffman sat at the rough wooden table in the prisoners' recreation room, struggling to compose a letter to her mother in Munich. The International Red Cross mail system allowed prisoners to send brief, censored letters home, though Greta had no way of knowing whether her mother still lived or whether Munich itself remained anything more than rubble. Still, writing provided a connection to normalcy, a thread linking her present captivity to an uncertain future. The words came slowly, constrained by censorship regulations and her own confusion about what she had experienced. "Dearest Mutti," she wrote in careful script, "I am healthy and treated correctly according to Geneva Conventions. The food is adequate, and we have shelter. Today I witnessed something that made me think of our conversations before the war. When you spoke of your grandmother who ran her own textile business in Berlin before the Great War, you said she was unusual, that times changed, and women's proper sphere narrowed. Here in America, perhaps times are changing again in a different direction." She paused, knowing that censors would read these words, wondering how much truth could survive the crossing of that divide. How could she explain to her mother, a woman who had embraced Nazi ideology's celebration of traditional motherhood, who had raised her daughters to be good wives and mothers in service to the folk, that American women handled rifles with the same competence German men displayed? How could she convey that this fact had shaken something fundamental in her understanding of the world without seeming to embrace the enemy's values? Yet dishonesty seemed pointless now. Everything familiar had collapsed into ruin. Perhaps honesty was all that remained. Meanwhile, in the WAC barracks on the other side of Camp Swift, Corporal Judith Martinez was composing her own letter, this one addressed to her younger sister Rosa in San Antonio. Unlike Greta, Judith faced no official censorship of outgoing mail, but she carefully edited her thoughts nonetheless, knowing that her family still struggled with her decision to enlist. "Rosa," she wrote, "you asked me in your last letter whether I regret joining up, whether the training is too hard or the work too military. Today I supervised some German POWs, women auxiliaries captured in Europe, and they watched us do rifle qualification in the morning. They looked absolutely shocked, Rosa. One of them told me later that in Germany they never expected women to handle weapons. It made me realize how much we take for granted. Historical records maintained by the WAC Museum at Fort McClellan indicate that correspondence between servicewomen and their families often revealed tensions between traditional expectations and wartime realities. Many families worried that military service would damage their daughters' marriage prospects or feminine nature, concerns that the women themselves had to navigate carefully in their communications home. Judith's letters to Rosa often walked this tightrope, trying to maintain family connections while asserting her own choices and experiences. "I've been thinking," Judith continued, "about Papa and why he was so angry when I enlisted. I think maybe he's afraid. Afraid that if women can do these things, it means the world he understands is changing into something he won't recognize. But Rosa, the thing is, the world is changing, whether Papa accepts it or not. And maybe that's not such a terrible thing. When the war ends, I don't think women are going to just forget what we've done, what we've learned we can do. The German prisoners I met, they seem almost jealous, like they're seeing possibilities they never imagined for themselves." Back in the prisoners' recreation room, Greta continued her letter, having decided on honesty. "Mutti, the American women soldiers train with rifles like infantry. They are competent and professional. This shocks me not because they perform poorly, but because they perform well. I find myself wondering what I might have become if I had been born here, or if our world had valued different things. Please do not think I betray our homeland by these observations. I am only trying to understand what I have seen, and what it might mean for whatever future awaits us." Both women sealed their letters that evening. Greta's to be routed through Red Cross channels with uncertain delivery, Judith's to be posted through regular military mail. Neither woman could have known that their letters, preserved in family archives and military records, would decades later provide historians with valuable first-hand accounts of this unusual cultural encounter. In the moment, they were simply two young women trying to process and communicate experiences that challenged their understanding of gender, nationality, and possibility. The first week of May 1945 brought news of Germany's unconditional surrender to Camp Swift, reaching the POW compound through official announcements and the barely suppressed jubilation of American guards. For the German prisoners, the end of hostilities meant a strange limbo. The war was over, but their captivity continued indefinitely. Greta Hoffman received the news with a numb combination of relief and grief, wondering what remained of her homeland and whether her family had survived the final collapse. Yet amid this emotional turmoil, an unexpected opportunity emerged. Selected prisoners would be allowed to attend educational lectures organized by the camp's Special Projects Division, an initiative designed to begin the process of denazification and democratic re-education. On May 7, 1945, the very day the Wehrmacht signed instruments of surrender at Reims, France, Greta found herself in a converted warehouse building alongside 30 other female prisoners, awaiting a lecture titled Democratic Institutions and Civic Participation. The irony of the timing was not lost on anyone present. When the instructor entered, however, Greta experienced a jolt of recognition. It was Corporal Judith Martinez, the WAC soldier she had spoken with briefly during laundry duty. Today, however, Judith wore a different hat. She had been assigned as the enlisted assistant to Captain Eleanor Whitmore, a WAC officer with a doctorate in political science from the University of Chicago, who had designed the women prisoners' re-education curriculum. Captain Whitmore, a severe-looking woman in her early 40s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, began the lecture without preamble. "You have lived under a totalitarian system that claimed to represent the will of the German people while actually crushing individual rights and dignity," she stated bluntly, her German fluent though heavily accented. "Today we begin examining what genuine democracy requires, not blind obedience, but informed participation, not propaganda, but education, not subjects, but citizens." The words were harsh, but Whitmore delivered them without personal rancor, as statements of fact requiring examination rather than insults requiring defense. As documented in the work Embracing Democracy in Modern Germany by historian Hannah Schisler, American re-education efforts in POW camps represented an early attempt to reshape German political culture, though their effectiveness remained controversial and limited. The Special Projects Division lectures walked a difficult line between genuine education and cultural imperialism, between acknowledging Nazi crimes and respecting prisoners' fundamental humanity. Captain Whitmore seemed conscious of these tensions, repeatedly inviting questions and discussion, rather than simply delivering monologues. Halfway through the lecture, Whitmore turned to women's political participation, and here Judith was invited to speak. In the United States, Judith began, clearly nervous about public speaking but committed to the material, women achieved the right to vote nationally in 1920 through the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. This was not a gift from men, it was won through decades of organized activism by women who insisted on their status as full citizens. Today, women vote, run for office, serve on juries, and yes, serve in the military. These are not special privileges. They are expressions of the basic principle that all citizens have responsibilities and rights in a democracy. Greta raised her hand, surprising herself with the boldness of the gesture. When acknowledged, she asked the question that had been haunting her. But does this not conflict with women's natural roles, with family and children? How do American families function when women are so active in public life? The question emerged awkwardly, revealing the depth of her ideological conditioning, even as she tried to think beyond it. Captain Whitmore and Corporal Martinez exchanged a knowing glance before the captain responded. "You are asking," Whitmore said carefully, "whether there is a fundamental conflict between women's civic participation and family life. The premise of your question assumes that women must choose one or the other, that public and private spheres cannot be reconciled. But consider, do we ask whether men can be both citizens and fathers? Do we insist that men's political participation makes them unfit for family life?" The reversal of perspective was so simple, yet so profound, that Greta felt something click into place in her understanding. The answer, Whitmore continued, is that democracy requires all adults to be both private individuals with personal lives and public citizens with civic responsibilities. Gender does not exempt anyone from either sphere. By mid-May of 1945, a routine had established itself at Camp Swift that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The German women prisoners attended regular re-education lectures, worked at various camp facilities, and increasingly engaged in cautious conversations with their American guards and instructors. On May 15th, Greta Hoffmann and 5 other German women were selected for an unusual assignment. They would assist with inventory in the WAC supply depot, working directly alongside American servicewomen in a supervised but relatively integrated environment. The assignment represented a measured experiment in trust and rehabilitation, testing whether prisoners could be gradually reintroduced to normal human interaction after years of totalitarian indoctrination. The supply depot occupied a sprawling complex of warehouses near the camp's southern perimeter, filled with everything from uniforms to office supplies, rifles to typewriters. Corporal Judith Martinez supervised the work detail, joined by 2 other WAC soldiers, Private Emma Washington, a quiet woman from Detroit who handled equipment requisitions, and Private First Class Rita Sullivan from Boston, a brash mechanic who maintained the depot's vehicles. The combination created an environment that exposed the German prisoners to a cross-section of American diversity that propaganda had never prepared them for. "You're telling me you never fired a rifle before you joined up?" Margareta Schiller was asking Emma Washington during the morning break, their conversation facilitated by Margareta's improving English and Emma's patient repetition of difficult concepts. Emma shook her head, smiling. "Never touched one till basic training. My daddy's a postal worker. Mama's a seamstress. We're city people. Guns weren't part of our life. But the Army taught me, same as they taught everybody else. Turned out I'm pretty good at it." She said this without pride or apology, simply stating a fact about acquired competence. For Margaret, who had grown up absorbing Nazi racial ideology, the casual competence of this Black American woman created a particularly acute cognitive dissonance. The propaganda she had internalized insisted on racial hierarchies where African peoples occupied the lowest rungs, yet here was Emma, literate, articulate, technically skilled, and entrusted with significant responsibility in the American military apparatus. The contradiction between ideology and observed reality was impossible to ignore. Watching Emma methodically process a complex equipment requisition form, Cross-referencing supply codes with practiced efficiency, Margaret felt another piece of her old worldview crumble. Rita Sullivan, meanwhile, had engaged Greta in a discussion about mechanical systems while they inventoried engine parts. "See, the thing about engines," Rita explained, her Boston accent thick as harbor fog, "is they don't care who works on them. Oil and gasoline and compression ratios, they work the same whether you're a man or woman, rich or poor, Catholic or Protestant. That's what I like about mechanical work. It's honest. You do it right, it works. You do it wrong, it doesn't. No politics involved." She gestured at the organized chaos of parts surrounding them. "Before the war, I couldn't get work as a mechanic. Shop owners would tell me women don't have the strength or the brains for it. Now here I am keeping a whole motor pool running. Funny how war changes what's possible." According to Brenda L. Moore's research documented in To Serve My Country, To Serve My Race, the story of the only African-American WAC stationed overseas during World War II, published by NYU Press, Black women in the Women's Army Corps faced a double burden of discrimination based on both race and gender, yet many found military service offered opportunities unavailable in civilian life. The presence of women like Emma Washington in positions of responsibility at places like Camp Swift represented a quiet but significant challenge to both German prisoners' racial ideology and American society's own segregationist practices. During the lunch break, the 6 German prisoners sat together at one end of a long table while the 3 American women occupied the other end, a physical separation that reflected lingering barriers of language, culture, and recent enmity. Yet Greta noticed that the distance had decreased since that first day. They now shared the same room, the same table, even if different ends. Small progress, perhaps, but progress nonetheless. She watched Rita Sullivan laugh at something Emma had said, watched the easy camaraderie between women of different races and backgrounds, and wondered whether this casual equality was genuinely possible or merely a performance for prisoners' benefit. As if reading her thoughts, Judith Martinez caught her eye and offered a slight smile that seemed to say, "This is real. This is who we are." As May progressed toward June in 1945, the weather in central Texas shifted from spring mildness to summer heat that made the prisoners' barracks feel like ovens by afternoon. On May 29th, during what had become a regular Tuesday education session, Captain Eleanor Whitmore introduced a new component to the curriculum: testimonies from women's rights activists and suffragettes, presented through documentary films and translated written materials. The session began with footage from the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C., showing thousands of women marching for political rights while hostile crowds jeered and, in some cases, physically attacked them. For the German prisoners, the images provided a jarring reminder that women's expanded roles in American society had not emerged naturally or easily, but through sustained political struggle. Greta Hoffman watched the grainy black and white footage with an intensity that surprised her. The women on screen wore the long skirts and elaborate hats of a previous generation, yet their determination and organization felt entirely contemporary. These women were beaten, arrested, force-fed during hunger strikes. Captain Whitmore narrated over the images. They endured mockery and social ostracism, but they persisted for decades until they secured the constitutional right to vote. Democracy is not a gift handed down from benevolent rulers. It is wrested from unwilling powers through organized resistance and moral courage. The lecture continued with examples from multiple democratic movements: the abolition of slavery, labor organizing, civil rights advocacy. Captain Whitmore presented these not as simple triumphs of good over evil, but as ongoing struggles where progress was contested, partial and fragile. "America is not perfect," she stated bluntly. "We still struggle with racism, with economic inequality, with prejudice against various groups. The difference between democracy and totalitarianism is not that democracy achieves perfection, but that it creates structures allowing citizens to challenge injustice, to organize for change, to speak truth to power, without being destroyed for it." After the formal presentation ended, Whitmore opened the floor for discussion, and Ilse Brandt, the young typist from Berlin, asked a question that had clearly been troubling her. But if women in America had to fight so hard for basic rights, and if problems like racism still exist, how is this system better than what we had? We were told that the Führer created a new social order, where everyone knew their place and purpose, where there was unity instead of conflict. The question was not hostile but genuinely confused, reflecting the cognitive difficulty of abandoning a comprehensive worldview. Captain Whitmore leaned forward, her severe expression softening slightly. What you call knowing your place is another way of saying you have no choice, no voice in determining your own life's direction. What you call unity was achieved by crushing dissent, murdering millions who didn't fit the prescribed categories, and dragging your nation into a catastrophic war. Conflict, debate, and struggle are not flaws in democracy. They are features. They represent the reality that humans disagree about important things, and we need systems for negotiating those disagreements without violence or tyranny. As documented in Robert G. Muller's article, Protecting Mother's Work, From Production to Reproduction in Post-War West Germany, in the Journal of Social History, the reconstruction of German gender ideology after World War II involved complex negotiations between democratic principles and traditional cultural values. The re-education efforts represented in Captain Whitmore's lectures aimed to introduce democratic concepts without entirely erasing German cultural identity, a balance that proved extraordinarily difficult to achieve. That evening, long after the lecture ended, Greta lay in her bunk thinking about a specific image from the suffrage footage. A young woman, perhaps 20 years old, being dragged away by police while other women locked arms and continued marching. The young woman's face had shown not fear but defiant determination, a commitment to something beyond herself. Greta realized she had never committed herself to anything beyond obedience. Obedience to parents, to teachers, to the state, to ideology. She had mistaken compliance for virtue and called her lack of agency knowing her place. The recognition was both humiliating and strangely liberating. If the past had been based on falsehood, perhaps the future could be built on different foundations. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The first week of June 1945 brought unexpected news to Camp Swift. The War Department had approved a pilot program allowing selected prisoners of war to participate in limited correspondence with American pen pals. Supervised exchanges intended to humanize former enemies and begin building foundations for post-war reconciliation. Captain Eleanor Whitmore announced the program during a June 5th education session, explaining that participants would be carefully vetted and all correspondence would be monitored by censors. "This is an opportunity," she said, "to practice democracy in its most basic form. The free exchange of ideas between individuals who see each other as fellow human beings rather than enemy abstractions." Greta Hoffman volunteered immediately, motivated partly by genuine curiosity and partly by the suffocating boredom of camp routine. 2 weeks later, she received her first letter from an American correspondent, Ruth Goldstein, a 26-year-old Jewish schoolteacher from New York City, whose parents had immigrated from Germany in 1933 after recognizing the Nazi threat early. The letter began with careful courtesy. "Dear Greta, I hope this letter finds you in good health," before moving to substantive content about Ruth's work teaching elementary school in Brooklyn and her thoughts about rebuilding international understanding after the war's devastation. What struck Greta most forcefully was a passage near the letter's end. "I wonder if you can understand how strange it is for me to write to a German woman, knowing that people with my background were systematically murdered by your government, while ordinary Germans went about their daily lives. I do not hold you personally responsible for the Holocaust. I understand the difference between individual guilt and collective responsibility. But I need you to know what was done in your nation's name. And I need to believe that Germans can eventually acknowledge this horror, rather than denying or minimizing it. Can we build understanding on that foundation of terrible truth?" The directness of Ruth's question forced Greta to confront what she had been avoiding. In the weeks since Germany's surrender, information about concentration camps had circulated through Camp Swift. Both official reports and whispered conversations among prisoners who had heard things, seen things, suspected things during the war. Greta had participated in the psychological defense mechanism common among Germans. We didn't know. How could we know? It must be exaggerated. Surely it wasn't that bad. But Ruth's letter, with its combination of directness and willingness to engage despite everything, made continued evasion feel like moral cowardice. Over the following weeks, Greta and Ruth exchanged multiple letters that addressed increasingly difficult topics. Ruth described her parents' escape from Munich, Greta's own hometown, and their difficult adjustment to American life as refugees who had lost everything. Greta, in turn, wrote carefully about her growing awareness that she had lived inside a comprehensive system of lies, that her entire political and moral education had been corrupted from its foundation. "I cannot claim I am suddenly a different person," she wrote in one letter. "The ideas I absorbed did not disappear simply because Germany lost the war, but I am trying to examine them, to understand where they came from and why they were false." According to testimony archived in the Museum of Jewish Heritage, exchanges between German POWs and American Jews during and after World War II represented particularly fraught attempts at reconciliation and understanding. Many Jewish Americans struggled with rage and grief over the Holocaust, making engagement with Germans, even anti-Nazi Germans, emotionally exhausting. Ruth Goldstein's willingness to participate in the Pen Pal program despite her family's history reflected both extraordinary personal generosity and a pragmatic recognition that building a peaceful future required confronting painful pasts rather than avoiding them. In late June, during another supply depot work shift, Greta asked Corporal Judith Martinez about her own family background, wondering whether similar stories of displacement or persecution existed in her history. Judith's response surprised her. "My family's been in Texas since before it was part of the United States. We're Tejanos, Mexican Americans. We've faced plenty of discrimination, but it's different from what Jewish people experienced in Europe. Still, I understand something about being seen as less than fully human, about having your loyalty questioned no matter what you do." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "That's why this matters. The Women's Corps, the integration efforts, all of it. When you start seeing people as individuals instead of categories, it gets harder to justify treating them as less than human." By mid-July of 1945, the pace of change at Camp Swift accelerated as the War Department began planning for the eventual repatriation of prisoners to a defeated, occupied, and devastated Germany. The female prisoners existed in an odd temporal suspension, no longer at war, not yet truly at peace, caught between a destroyed past and an uncertain future. On July 18th, Captain Eleanor Whitmore convened a final education session for the women who had participated in the re-education program, a capstone discussion about what they had learned and how they might apply it upon return to Germany. "You will go home to a country that has been utterly defeated," Captain Whitmore began without preamble, her habitual directness unchanged after months of teaching. "Your cities are in ruins. Your political system has been abolished. Your economy is shattered. Millions of your countrymen are dead, displaced, or broken. You will face hunger, homelessness, and hardship that may make you nostalgic even for this POW camp. In those difficult times, you will be tempted to retreat into old certainties, old ways of thinking that feel comfortable and familiar. I'm asking you not to do that." She paused, her gaze moving across the assembled women. "Instead, I am asking you to remember what you have learned here, that women can be citizens and soldiers, mothers and professionals, that democracy, despite its messiness and conflicts, offers human dignity that totalitarianism never can, that people of different races and religions can cooperate as equals, that admitting national guilt is not weakness but the necessary foundation for genuine renewal. These lessons will not make your immediate future easier. In fact, they may make it harder, because you will see clearly how much must change in German society. But they are true lessons, and truth matters." Greta Hoffmann raised her hand, and when acknowledged, she spoke words she had been rehearsing mentally for days. "Captain Whitmore, Corporal Martinez, all of the American soldiers we have met, I want to thank you for treating us as people capable of learning and changing, not just as enemies to be punished. When I first saw the American women firing rifles in April, it shocked me because it contradicted everything I had been taught. Now I understand that my shock reflected the narrowness of my education, not the unnaturalness of women's competence. I do not know what I will do when I return to Germany, or even whether my family survived to return to. But I know I will not forget what I have seen here. Margaret Schiller added her own thoughts. I was trained as a nurse in a system that valued some lives and dismissed others as unworthy. Here I have seen that medical competence and human compassion can exist without ideological sorting of patients into worthy and unworthy categories. When I practice nursing again, if I practice nursing again, I will try to carry that lesson with me. Similar testimonies followed from other prisoners, each woman struggling to articulate how their worldview had been challenged and partially transformed by their months in American captivity. On August 2, 1945, Greta received what would be her final letter from Ruth Goldstein before repatriation. Ruth wrote, "I have been thinking about what rebuilding Germany means, and I believe it requires Germans who can honestly confront what happened and commit themselves to building something different. Not better than others. Democratic societies don't claim moral superiority, but accountable to basic human rights and dignity. You may not believe this, Greta, but I have hope for you and women like you. You have seen alternatives to totalitarian thinking. You have experienced treating and being treated as full human beings. Those experiences can become seeds for a different future, if you cultivate them despite the rocky soil you will face." As documented in extensive historical research including Atina Grossman's Jews, Germans, and Allies, Close Encounters in Occupied Germany, the post-war reconstruction of German society involved complicated processes of denazification, re-education, and cultural transformation. The women who had experienced America's women's military service as POWs represented a tiny fraction of the German population. Yet their experiences illustrated broader tensions between traditional gender ideology and democratic principles that would shape post-war German society. In late August, the female prisoners learned they would be repatriated in early September, transported first to New York, and then by military ship to Bremen. On their final evening at Camp Swift, Corporal Judith Martinez brought a gift to the prisoners' barracks. A photograph taken during the April rifle training that had first shocked the German women. In the image, 30 Women's Army Corps soldiers stood at attention, rifles at their sides, professional and confident. On the back, Judith had written in careful script, "Women's Army Corps Rifle Qualification, April 23, 1945. Remember that capability has no gender." Greta accepted the photograph with tears in her eyes, recognizing the generosity of the gesture. This image would travel with her back to whatever remained of Munich, a tangible reminder that alternatives to Nazi ideology were not just theoretical possibilities but lived realities. She thought of the journey ahead, the literal journey across the Atlantic, and the longer journey of helping build a different kind of Germany from the ruins of the old. The task seemed impossible, overwhelming. But the photograph suggested that impossible things sometimes proved achievable when courage met opportunity. Years later, in interviews conducted during the 1970s for oral history projects documenting women's World War II experiences, both Greta Hoffmann and Judith Martinez would remember that April morning when their paths first crossed at Camp Swift. Greta, by then a social worker in rebuilt Munich who had devoted her career to refugee assistance, recalled the shock of cognitive dissonance that began her long process of ideological transformation. Judith, retired from a career in education and civil rights advocacy, remembered the strange experience of being simultaneously a guard and a role model, a victor showing unexpected respect to the vanquished. Neither woman claimed that one morning changed everything. Personal and cultural transformation does not work that way. But both agreed that witnessing women firing rifles at a Texas prisoner of war camp in the spring of 1945 represented a moment when rigid ideological certainties cracked open, allowing new possibilities to emerge from the ruins of old assumptions. That moment of shock, of dissonance, of uncomfortable recognition, that was where change began.